In 1897, a young worker stepped into a crowded American lunch counter, where a simple meal of ground beef between bread was becoming part of a changing nation. Across cities like New York, Chicago, and St. Louis, millions of immigrants, factory workers, and travelers were searching for food that was cheap, fast, and filling. By the end of the 19th century, American cities had grown by millions of people. Railroads stretched across thousands of miles, and new industries were pulling workers into exhausting days of labor. Meat was becoming more available, but feeding a rapidly expanding population was still a challenge. Yet there is one ingredient that quietly transformed all of this: ground beef, a food once associated with scraps. Preservation and practicality became the foundation of the most recognizable sandwich on earth. Today, you can buy a hamburger for a few dollars, eat one almost anywhere, and barely think about the centuries of migration, invention, and cultural exchange hidden inside those two pieces of bread. So how did a humble mixture of chopped meat go from ancient survival food to America's favorite meal? How did it travel across continents, pass through empires, and become a symbol of modern life? This story starts thousands of years before the first American hamburger stand. In the ancient world where people first discovered that grinding meat could solve a very simple problem, how to make food last longer and become easier to eat. The hamburger did not begin in a restaurant, it began with necessity. Thousands of years ago, before refrigeration, before supermarkets, before the idea of a fast food chain existed, you lived in a world where preserving food was a daily battle. Animals were valuable. A hunt could determine whether a family survived a winter. A successful harvest could decide whether a village prospered or disappeared, and meat had a problem. Fresh meat did not wait. It spoiled quickly. It attracted insects. It carried the constant danger of decay in a world without modern preservation. So ancient people experimented. They dried it. They salted it. They smoked it. They cut it into smaller pieces. They mixed it with grains, herbs, and spices. Grinding meat was not simply a culinary choice, it was technology. Think about that for a second. Today, a meat grinder looks ordinary, almost boring. It sits quietly in a kitchen or behind a butcher counter. But the basic idea behind it was revolutionary. It allowed people to transform tougher cuts and leftover pieces into something softer, easier to chew, and easier to combine with other ingredients. This was not about creating a luxury dish. It was about efficiency, survival, and making every part of an animal useful. The earliest ancestors of the hamburger appeared in many forms across different cultures, and this is where the story becomes complicated. There was no single ancient inventor who created the hamburger. There was no forgotten chef who suddenly placed ground meat on bread and changed history. Instead, there was a slow human pattern. People everywhere discovered the same solution to the same problem. Cut the meat smaller, season it, shape it, cook it. Across the ancient world, nomadic peoples developed ways to preserve and transport meat over long distances. In Central Asia, horse cultures relied on portable foods that could survive harsh conditions. Some later traditions connected to these practices involved minced meat preparations carried during travel. Although the exact links between those foods and the modern hamburger remain debated, and that debate matters, because history is often not a straight road. It is a collection of paths that cross. A popular story claims that warriors of the Mongol Empire placed pieces of meat beneath their saddles while riding, allowing the pressure and movement to tenderize the meat. Whether every detail of this legend is accurate remains uncertain. Historians debate how much of this practice was common reality and how much was a later romanticized story. But the existence of the legend tells you something important. People understood the value of transforming meat into a portable, durable food. The same basic idea continued moving westward. Traders, soldiers, and travellers carried culinary traditions across the enormous networks that connected Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Ingredients changed, techniques changed, local tastes changed. The hamburger was not born from one culture alone. It was built through centuries of exchange. By the medieval period, European cooks were preparing chopped or mincemeat dishes, especially in regions where preserving and using every available resource mattered, in wealthy households. Finely prepared meat could become an elaborate dish. Among ordinary people, grinding meat often had a more practical purpose, making difficult cuts edible. This distinction is important. Ground meat was not always considered fashionable. For much of history, the best cuts of meat were associated with status. A whole roast displayed wealth. A carefully prepared piece of beef showed abundance. Ground meat, by contrast, was often linked to thrift. It was what you did when you wanted to avoid waste. The future hamburger carried that contradiction from the beginning. It was humble and practical. It was also endlessly adaptable. And here is the detail that makes this story fascinating. The hamburger became famous not because it started as a prestigious meal, but because it perfectly matched the world that was coming. A world of crowded cities, industrial labor, migration, and people constantly moving faster. But before America built an empire around the hamburger, Europe had to reshape the idea of ground meat first. The next transformation would happen in a port city where sailors, merchants, and immigrants created the connection that would give this food its famous name, Hamburg. When you follow the story of the hamburger backward, you do not find a restaurant. You find ships, marketplaces, military camps, and ancient cities where food had to serve a purpose. It had to travel. It had to survive. It had to feed people who were constantly moving. The combination of meat and bread was one of humanity's great practical inventions, not because it was fancy, because it worked. Across civilizations, people discovered that a piece of bread could become more than a side dish. It could become a container, a plate, and a tool. It protected food from dirty hands. It made meals portable. It allowed workers, soldiers, and travelers to eat while continuing their journeys. Think about that for a second. A sandwich seems ordinary today, but the idea that you could hold your entire meal in your hand changed the relationship between people and food. The hamburger would eventually become the ultimate expression of that idea, but centuries before anyone placed a beef patty between two buns. Ancient societies were already experimenting with portable meals built around bread and meat. In the ancient Middle East, flatbreads became essential parts of daily life. Civilizations such as Mesopotamia developed advanced agricultural systems based around wheat and barley. Bread was not simply something placed beside a meal. It was one of the foundations of survival. It was taxed. It was traded. It was used as payment. Workers could receive grain rations or bread allowances as part of their compensation. The very word salary would later connect to another essential commodity, salt. But across many ancient societies, bread itself represented economic security. Bread was wealth. Bread was stability. Bread was life. Now combine that with meat. In ancient societies, Meat was often connected with celebration, sacrifice, military success, or wealth. Most people did not eat large portions of beef every day. Livestock represented stored value. A cow was not just food. It was labor, milk, reproduction, and economic security. You did not casually turn an animal into dinner, you planned for it. This is why techniques that stretched meat became so important. Mixing meat with grains, herbs, and other ingredients allowed communities to feed more people from limited supplies. This was not wasteful cooking, it was intelligent cooking. The ancient Greeks and Romans developed complex food cultures where minced and seasoned preparations appeared alongside countless other dishes. Roman cooks created elaborate recipes using meat, spices, wine, and sauces. They understood that texture could be transformed and that seasoning could completely change a simple ingredient. The Romans especially understood the power of food as an empire-building tool. Food travelled with armies. Food travelled along roads. Food travelled through ports. The Roman Empire connected huge regions of Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean through trade networks that moved not only soldiers and coins, but also recipes and habits. A soldier stationed far from home might encounter unfamiliar foods and unfamiliar cooking methods. A merchant crossing the Mediterranean might carry ingredients from one market to another. Every empire created a kind of culinary exchange. Some foods moved because they were valuable. Some moved because they were practical. Some moved simply because people missed the flavors of home. The future hamburger belonged to the second category: practical, portable, adaptable. But here is the twist. The hamburger's journey was not only about meat. It was about the people who needed food that matched changing societies. As cities grew, people spent more time away from farms. As armies expanded, soldiers needed reliable meals. As trade routes connected distant regions, travelers needed foods that could survive the journey. The world was slowly creating the conditions for a food like the hamburger. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, another important development was taking shape. The cold climate and agricultural traditions of the region encouraged people to find new ways of preserving and preparing meat. In areas that would later become part of Germany, cooks developed dishes based around chopped beef. These preparations were practical responses to the realities of life in a colder environment, where preserving food through salting, smoking, and grinding was essential. By the early modern period, one particular city became closely associated with this style of food: Hamburg, a major port on the Elbe River. Hamburg was one of Europe's busiest trading centres. Ships arrived carrying goods from across the world. Sailors departed carrying supplies for long voyages. Merchants moved through the city constantly, and in this environment, food became shaped by movement. Hamburg was not an isolated town preserving an ancient recipe unchanged for centuries. It was a crossroads, a place where ideas collided, a place where travellers carried memories of meals from distant places. The city became associated with the dish known as Hamburg steak, a seasoned preparation of minced beef. It was not yet the hamburger you know today. There was no fast food counter, no paper wrapper, no drive-through window. It was a different world. A meal that sounded European. A meal connected to a major trading city. A meal that would eventually cross the Atlantic. And here is the strange part. The hamburger would become one of the strongest symbols of American culture. Yet its name would come from a German city thousands of miles away. The food would become associated with speed, convenience, and mass production. But its earliest identity was connected to sailors, merchants, and slow-moving ships. It was not born in a factory. It was not born under neon lights. It was shaped in kitchens where people were simply trying to make meat more useful. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because once Hamburg's food traditions met the enormous waves of immigration moving toward North America, the humble chopped beef dish entered a new world. A world of crowded cities, a world of industrial workers, a world hungry for something cheap, filling, and fast. The hamburger was about to stop being a regional dish. It was about to become an American invention. The journey from Hamburg to America was not a straight line. It was a movement of people, ideas, and memories carried across an ocean by millions of individuals searching for a different life. The hamburger did not arrive in America as a finished product. It arrived as a collection of traditions waiting to be transformed. In the 19th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Industrialization was pulling people into crowded cities. Political unrest was shaking old governments. Economic hardship was forcing families to make difficult decisions. For many Europeans, especially Germans, America represented opportunity. Between 1820 and 1900, millions of Germans immigrated to the United States, creating one of the largest migration movements in American history. They brought languages, customs, music, religious traditions, and of course, food. Food travels with people. Think about that for a second. When someone leaves their homeland, they do not only carry objects, they carry memories. They carry the smell of a family kitchen. They carry the taste of celebrations. They carry the recipes that remind them who they are. The Hamburg steak was one of those memories. In America, German immigrants introduced dishes connected to their homeland, including seasoned minced beef preparations often called Hamburg steak. It appeared in restaurants, cookbooks, and hotel menus throughout the 19th century. But America was not simply copying Europe. America was changing everything it touched. The United States was expanding westward. Railroads were crossing the continent. Cities were growing at an incredible speed. Factories were filling with workers who needed affordable meals during long working days. The old world had created the ingredients. The new world created the demand, and that demand changed everything. Here is the detail that makes this transformation fascinating. A hamburger was not originally considered a fast food. It was closer to a formal dish. In many restaurants, Hamburg steak was served on plates with sauces, vegetables, and expensive presentation. It looked more like a European dinner than the handheld meal we recognize today. The idea of putting the meat between bread came later, and that small decision changed history. The exact person who first created the hamburger sandwich remains one of the great food mysteries. Several American cities claimed the honor. Several individuals became connected to competing origin stories. Like many famous inventions, the truth became mixed with advertising, local pride, and incomplete records. One popular claim comes from New Haven, Connecticut, where a customer at Louis' lunch supposedly asked for a meal he could carry while attending a fair in the late 19th century. The restaurant later became famous for claiming it created the hamburger sandwich. Another claim comes from Wisconsin, where a young food vendor named Charlie Negreen was said to have flattened meatballs and placed them between bread so customers could eat while walking at a fair. Whether every detail of this story is accurate remains debated. There were also claims connected to Texas, Ohio, and other parts of America. And this is the reality of food history. The person who invents a meal is often not the person who makes it famous. The hamburger likely emerged from many people solving the same problem at the same time. How do you feed a busy population? How do you make meat portable? How do you create something inexpensive, satisfying, and easy to eat? The answer was simple, bread, meat, convenience. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, America was becoming the perfect environment for the hamburger to grow. Cities were packed with workers who needed quick meals. Street vendors and lunch counters became common. Businesses searched for ways to serve more customers faster. This was not just about food, it was about a new way of life. The industrial age changed how people worked, travelled, and ate. A farmer might spend hours preparing a meal at home. A factory worker might have only a short break between shifts. A portable meal was not a luxury. It was a solution. The hamburger fit perfectly into this new rhythm. It was affordable. It was filling. It required no complicated equipment. It could be produced quickly. And unlike many foods associated with wealth, the hamburger was democratic. A wealthy businessman and a factory worker could both eat one. Not the same version, not in the same setting, but the same basic food. That was powerful. The hamburger became connected with the idea of American mobility. It matched a nation where people were constantly moving from farms to cities, from cities to new territories, and from one opportunity to another. But there was another force helping the hamburger rise, the automobile. As cars became more common in the early 20th century, Americans gained a new relationship with distance. Roads connected communities. Travelers needed places to stop. Restaurants began adapting to a population that no longer walked everywhere. The future of food was becoming faster, and the hamburger was ready. Here is the twist. The hamburger did not become famous because people suddenly discovered ground beef was delicious. Humans had been eating variations of chopped meat for centuries. It became famous because America changed around it. The hamburger was the right food at the right moment. It matched industrial labor. It matched urban growth. It matched transportation. It matched the desire for convenience. This was not a meal designed by one genius. It was a meal shaped by millions of ordinary decisions. A German immigrant preserving a familiar recipe, a street vendor trying to satisfy hungry customers, a restaurant owner trying to serve people faster, a worker looking for an affordable lunch. All of them contributed to the creation of something that would eventually become one of the most recognizable foods on Earth. But the hamburger still had a long journey ahead, because becoming popular was only the beginning. The next step was transformation. The humble sandwich would soon enter a new era of mass production, advertising, and industrial efficiency. The hamburger was about to become more than food. It was about to become a symbol. The hamburger's name carried the memory of a European port city, but its future would be shaped thousands of miles away in a country that was changing faster than almost anywhere on Earth. By the beginning of the 20th century, America was becoming a nation of factories, railways, crowded neighborhoods, and constant movement. People were hungry, not just physically hungry for speed, hungry for opportunity, hungry for a life that moved differently from the generations before them. And the hamburger was perfectly designed for this new world. The early hamburger was still finding its identity. It existed in restaurants, at fairs, and in small food stands. But it had not yet become the cultural giant you recognize today. It was one option among many. Sandwiches were becoming increasingly common, but there was no guarantee that a ground beef patty would become America's favorite. History is filled with moments where something ordinary suddenly becomes extraordinary because the world around it changes. This was one of those moments. The rise of the hamburger was connected to a much larger transformation in American society, the birth of modern consumer culture. By the early 1900s, cities were expanding rapidly. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and other urban centers were attracting workers from across the United States and from around the world. Tenements filled with families, factories operated for long hours. Public transportation carried millions of people between home and work. Meals had to adapt. The old rhythm of eating was changing. For centuries, many people prepared most of their meals at home because their work, communities, and daily routines were built around that system. But industrial cities created a different reality. Workers spent entire days away from their kitchens. They needed food that was affordable. They needed food that arrived quickly. They needed food that could be eaten during a short break. The hamburger answered all three needs. It was not complicated. It did not require expensive ingredients. It did not require a formal dining room. It was meat shaped into a simple form, placed inside bread, and handed to someone who needed to keep moving. Simple, but simplicity can be powerful. The hamburger also benefited from another major change: improvements in meat production and distribution. The growth of refrigerated rail transport allowed beef to move across enormous distances while remaining safer and more affordable. Before these changes, eating fresh meat often depended on location. A person living near farms or livestock markets had different options than someone living in a crowded city. Refrigeration changed that. A cow raised hundreds or thousands of miles away could become a meal in a city restaurant. That sounds normal today. It was revolutionary then. The distance between farm and table was shrinking, and companies were learning how to organize food production on a scale never seen before. Chicago became one of the most important centers of this transformation. The city's stockyards became famous for processing enormous numbers of animals. The smell, noise, and industrial efficiency of the stockyards represented both progress and the harsh realities of modern meat production. The system created cheaper food. It also created difficult questions about labor, animal treatment, and public health. Those questions would become impossible to ignore. In 1906, writer Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel exposing terrible conditions in Chicago's meatpacking industry. The book described unsanitary facilities, dangerous working conditions, and the exploitation of immigrant laborers. The reaction was enormous. The public response helped push the United States government towards stronger food safety regulations, including the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, both passed in 1906. This moment changed the relationship between Americans and industrial food. People wanted cheap food, but they also wanted to know that cheap food was safe. The hamburger industry would continue growing, but it would do so under increasing attention. Then came another major shift: the automobile. The car did not just change transportation, it changed where people ate. As more Americans owned automobiles in the 1920s and 1930s, roads became commercial spaces. Businesses appeared along highways. Restaurants began designing new ways to serve drivers who did not want to leave their vehicles. The hamburger was naturally suited for this environment. A person could hold it in one hand. A person could eat it quickly. A person could buy it almost anywhere. It was the perfect food for a mobile society. This is where the hamburger began moving away from being just a meal and toward becoming a cultural symbol. It represented convenience. It represented modern life. It represented the idea that good food did not have to be complicated. But here is the twist. The hamburger's greatest transformation would not come from chefs. It would come from businessmen who understood systems. They realized that the future was not simply selling burgers. The future was selling the same burger thousands, then millions, then billions of times. Consistency became the new ingredient. A customer wanted to know that a hamburger bought in one location would taste almost identical to one bought somewhere else. That idea sounds obvious now. It was not obvious then. It required new approaches to kitchens, labor, supply chains, and customer service. The hamburger was about to enter the age of the chain restaurant. And when that happened, everything changed. The sandwich that began as a practical solution for workers and travelers would become one of the most powerful symbols of American influence around the world. But before global domination came a quieter revolution. A small restaurant system in California would discover that the future of food was not about making one perfect hamburger. It was about making millions of identical ones. And that idea would reshape the world. The hamburger had already travelled a remarkable distance. It had moved from ancient methods of preserving meat, through European kitchens, across the Atlantic with immigrants, and into the crowded streets of industrial America. But the hamburger was still just a food. It was not yet an empire. That transformation would come from a simple idea: make the experience predictable. In the early 20th century, restaurants were often built around individual skill. A cook prepared meals differently depending on experience, ingredients, and circumstances. A customer might visit the same restaurant twice and receive two completely different versions of the same dish. For many foods, that was part of the charm. For the hamburger industry, it became a problem to solve. The future belonged to systems, and one of the earliest examples of this thinking appeared with the rise of White Castle. In 1916, Walter Anderson, a short-order cook from Kansas, opened a small hamburger stand in Wichita. Anderson understood something important about ground beef. The meat itself was not enough. The entire process mattered. He focused on cleanliness, speed, and consistency. The small square burgers he created were cooked on a bed of onions, producing a distinctive flavor while allowing many burgers to be prepared quickly. A few years later, Anderson partnered with Edgar Waldo Billy Ingram, a businessman who helped turn the idea into a growing company. In 1921, White Castle officially began operations. It was a small restaurant, but the idea behind it was enormous. White Castle was not simply selling hamburgers, it was selling trust. At a time when some Americans viewed ground beef with suspicion because of concerns about food quality, White Castle designed its restaurants to look clean and efficient. The bright white buildings, open kitchens, and carefully controlled methods were part of a strategy to convince customers that hamburgers were safe, modern, and respectable. The name itself helped. White Castle sounded reliable, it sounded permanent. It sounded almost like a monument. The company's small square burgers became famous, and the restaurant helped move the hamburger away from its earlier image as cheap street food. The hamburger was becoming acceptable everywhere. Workers ate it, families ate it, travelers ate it. The food that had once been associated with practicality was becoming part of everyday American culture. But another force was preparing to accelerate the hamburger's rise: the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the United States entered one of the most difficult economic periods in its history. Millions of people lost jobs. Families struggled to afford basic necessities. Restaurants faced enormous pressure. The hamburger survived because it was inexpensive. This was not a luxury meal. It was a meal built for difficult times. A person could spend a small amount of money and still receive something warm, filling, and satisfying. During economic hardship, foods that provide maximum value often become cultural anchors. The hamburger became one of them. Then came the Second World War. The conflict transformed American society once again. Millions of people entered military service. Women entered industrial workplaces in unprecedented numbers. Factories operated around the clock, producing equipment and supplies. Time became precious. Efficiency became essential. After the war ended in 1945, America entered a new era. Suburbs expanded. Families purchased automobiles. Highways connected communities. A new middle class emerged with more disposable income and more interest in convenience. This environment created the perfect conditions for the next hamburger revolution, and it began with two brothers in California. Richard and Maurice McDonald opened a drive-in restaurant in San Bernardino in 1948. At first, they operated like many other businesses of the era, offering a wide menu with car hop service, but they noticed a problem. Too many choices slowed everything down. So they redesigned the entire operation. They removed many menu items. They focused on a few products. They created a highly organized kitchen system. Hamburgers, French fries, milkshakes. That was largely it. This was not just a restaurant change. It was a manufacturing approach applied to food. The brothers created what became known as the speedy service system. Workers had specific tasks. Each movement was designed for efficiency. The kitchen operated almost like a factory assembly line. No unnecessary steps, no wasted motion, no confusion. It worked. And then came the man who would turn that local idea into a global force, Ray Kroc. Kroc was a milkshake machine salesman who visited the McDonald Brothers restaurant in 1954. He was fascinated by the speed and organization of the operation. He saw something larger than a successful restaurant. He saw a model that could be repeated across the country. The exact details of Kroc's relationship with the McDonald brothers have been debated and interpreted differently over the years. But the outcome is clear. Kroc became the driving force behind expanding McDonald's into a national and eventually global brand. The hamburger was no longer simply a meal. It was a system, a logo, a promise that the same experience could be found almost anywhere. And here is the strange contrast. The hamburger began as a food shaped by local traditions. It came from countless small decisions made by ordinary people across centuries. But its modern identity was created through standardization. The hamburger became famous by becoming the same. Think about that. A food that traveled across the world by changing became a global icon by refusing to change. That contradiction would define the hamburger's future. Because as chains expanded, they brought American fast food culture everywhere they went. Some people welcomed it as convenient and affordable. Others criticized it as a symbol of cultural change and industrialized eating. The hamburger became loved. The hamburger became criticized. The hamburger became impossible to ignore. And the next stage of the story would reveal just how powerful this simple sandwich could become. The golden arches were rising. The world was about to meet the hamburger on a completely new scale. The hamburger had already conquered America's roads, cities, and suburbs. But the most important transformation was still ahead. A simple sandwich was about to become one of the most recognizable symbols of American culture in human history. Not a symbol because it was expensive. Not a symbol because it was rare. Not a symbol because it was reserved for kings or emperors. The hamburger became powerful because almost anyone could have one. That was the revolution. By the 1950s and 1960s, the United States was entering a period of enormous economic growth. Millions of families moved into suburban neighborhoods. New highways connected distant communities. Shopping centers appeared outside city centers. The automobile became part of everyday life. The old world had marketplaces. The new world had parking lots. And the hamburger fit perfectly into this new landscape. Fast food was not simply about eating quickly. It reflected a completely different relationship with time. Families wanted convenience. Workers wanted affordable meals. Travelers wanted predictable stops on long journeys. The hamburger became the answer. But here is the twist. The success of fast food was not created only by better recipes. It was created by better systems. The restaurant became a machine. Every ingredient had a place. Every worker had a role. Every movement was measured. Every second mattered. This was the same philosophy that had transformed factories during the Industrial Age. Now it was being applied to food. The hamburger was becoming an industrial product, and the person who understood the enormous potential of this idea was Ray Kroc. After becoming involved with McDonald's in the 1950s, Kroc focused on expansion. He opened new locations, created strict operating standards, and developed a franchise system that allowed the brand to grow rapidly. The first McDonald's restaurant opened under Kroc's leadership in Des Plaines, Illinois, in 1955. The company expanded, then expanded again, then expanded faster than almost anyone expected. By the 1960s, McDonald's had become a national presence. The Golden Arches appeared in communities across America. And the hamburger became connected with a new kind of modern lifestyle, a family road trip, a quick lunch, a weekend outing, a meal after a baseball game. The hamburger was no longer just something you ate, it was something you experienced. And this is where the hamburger's cultural power became clear. Food can represent much more than hunger. Coffee can represent routine. Chocolate can represent comfort. Bread can represent survival. The hamburger came to represent speed, convenience, and a changing world. But every global success story has another side. The same systems that made hamburgers affordable also created new questions about labor, agriculture, and culture. The demand for cheap beef required enormous changes in farming and cattle production. Ranching expanded, feed systems developed, supply chains became more complex. The hamburger was no longer connected to one local butcher. It was connected to an international network. Cattle farms, feed producers, processing plants, transportation companies, restaurants, millions of workers. The hamburger had become an entire economy, and the numbers became enormous. By the late 20th century, Americans were eating billions of hamburgers each year. The hamburger industry became one of the largest parts of the global food economy, but this success created pressure. Producing huge quantities of beef required land, water, energy, and resources. Environmental researchers began examining the impact of cattle farming, including greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, and water use. The hamburger was still a simple meal, but the system behind it was anything but simple. This is where the story takes a darker turn. The hamburger was celebrated as a symbol of abundance, but producing that abundance came with hidden costs. Industrial meat production changed landscapes, it changed labor conditions, It changed the relationship between humans and animals. And here is the uncomfortable reality. The hamburger did not create these issues alone, but it became one of the clearest examples of how modern food systems could reshape the planet. By the late 20th century, the hamburger had reached a strange position. It was everywhere, it was familiar, it was almost ordinary. And that was exactly what made it powerful. A food that once represented American innovation had become part of global everyday life. You could find hamburgers in Tokyo. You could find hamburgers in Paris. You could find hamburgers in Moscow. You could find hamburgers in places where generations earlier, few people had ever seen beef prepared this way. The hamburger became a kind of cultural language, sometimes welcomed, sometimes resisted, always recognized. But the global spread of the hamburger was not simply the story of American companies opening restaurants abroad. It was also the story of local cultures adapting the hamburger to their own traditions. In Japan, restaurants developed versions using local flavors and ingredients. In India, where many people avoid beef for religious reasons, companies created alternatives using vegetables, chicken, and other ingredients. The hamburger changed. Again, that was always its greatest strength. It borrowed, it adapted, it survived. The same food that carried German roots, American industrial methods, and global business strategies could become something different in every country it entered. The hamburger was not one fixed thing. It was a template, a blank canvas, a cultural conversation between places, and that may be the biggest surprise of all. The hamburger became globally famous because it was both incredibly specific and incredibly flexible. A beef patty between bread, a worldwide symbol, a local creation everywhere it travelled. If you are finding this story interesting, hit subscribe. We cover the hidden histories behind everyday things, and there are many more stories waiting to be uncovered, because the hamburger's journey was far from finished. The world had accepted the burger. Now the burger was going to change the world in ways nobody expected. The hamburger had become an American icon, but icons do not stay in one place forever. By the second half of the 20th century, the hamburger began a journey that would transform it from a national favourite into a global language of food. The golden arches appeared in countries where the word hamburger had once sounded completely foreign. Restaurants built around speed, consistency, and convenience entered cities with thousands of years of their own culinary traditions. And something unexpected happened. The hamburger changed. Again, this was not a simple story of one country exporting its food to the rest of the world. It was a story of adaptation. Every place that welcomed the hamburger reshaped it according to local tastes, local customs, and local ideas about what a meal should be. That is why the hamburger survived. It was never just one recipe. It was an idea, a piece of bread, a central filling, a meal designed for movement. The details could change. The concept remained. The expansion accelerated after the 1970s as international travel increased and multinational restaurant companies searched for new markets. The hamburger became part of a larger wave of American cultural influence that included movies, music, clothing, and consumer brands. For many people around the world, the hamburger represented something modern. It represented cities. It represented youth culture. It represented a connection to a rapidly changing global economy. But the response was never identical everywhere. Some people embraced it immediately. Some people viewed it with curiosity. Some people saw it as a threat to traditional food cultures. And all of these reactions could exist at the same time. Food has always carried identity. A meal is never only a meal. It tells you where people come from, what they value, and how they understand the world around them. When the hamburger arrived in new countries, it entered conversations that had existed for centuries. What should people eat? What does modern life look like? What parts of tradition should remain? What parts should change? These questions followed the hamburger everywhere. In Japan, the hamburger entered a society known for careful attention to presentation, texture, and seasonal ingredients, rather than simply copying the American version. Japanese restaurants created their own interpretations. Some versions incorporated local flavors and ingredients, showing that the hamburger could become something new without losing its recognizable shape. In South Korea, the hamburger became associated with changing urban lifestyles and international influence. In large cities, fast food restaurants became gathering places for young people, offering not only food but a social experience. In Europe, the hamburger faced a more complicated relationship. The continent had its own deep traditions of bread, meat dishes, and regional cuisine. A hamburger was not filling an empty space. It was entering a crowded room, but it found its place. Restaurants created premium versions. Chefs experimented with different ingredients. Local producers adapted the concept. The hamburger moved from being seen only as inexpensive fast food into something that could also become a gourmet product. This transformation reveals something important. The hamburger has always existed between two worlds. It can be cheap, it can be expensive. It can be eaten in a paper wrapper. It can appear on a carefully designed restaurant plate. It can represent industrial food. It can represent culinary creativity. That contradiction is part of its identity. But the global rise of the hamburger also brought attention to the enormous industry behind it. The modern hamburger depends on a complicated chain that begins long before a customer walks into a restaurant. Cattle must be raised, feed must be produced, animals must be transported, meat must be processed, ingredients must be distributed, restaurants must operate. Millions of people participate in this system. The hamburger looks simple, the machinery behind it is not, and here is where the story becomes more complicated. The same efficiency that made hamburgers affordable created concerns about environmental impact. Beef production requires significant resources, especially land and water. Scientists studying climate change have examined the role of livestock emissions in global greenhouse gas output. The hamburger became a symbol of a larger question facing the modern world. How do you provide food for billions of people while protecting the planet that produces it? This question did not have an easy answer, because the hamburger represents both achievement and challenge. It represents human creativity. It represents industrial power. It represents the ability to feed large populations. It also represents the consequences of doing so on an enormous scale. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains why the hamburger became such a powerful cultural symbol. The hamburger did not become global because everyone wanted exactly the American version. It became global because people discovered they could make it their own. The same basic structure could carry different meanings. A beef burger in one country, a chicken burger in another, a vegetable-based version somewhere else. The hamburger became less like a fixed object and more like a language. Everyone could speak it differently. This flexibility allowed it to survive changes that destroyed many other food trends. Fashions disappear, restaurants close, consumer habits shift. The hamburger continued, because it understood something fundamental about human eating habits. People like food that is familiar but adaptable. They want tradition, but they also want discovery. They want comfort, but they want something new. The hamburger sits exactly in that space, and this is where the story takes another unexpected turn. For decades, the hamburger represented abundance, more meat, bigger portions, faster production, more convenience. But the future of the hamburger would challenge the very idea that made it famous. The next revolution would not come from adding more beef. It would come from asking whether beef was necessary at all. The hamburger had travelled from ancient preservation techniques to global restaurant chains. Now it was about to enter the age of science. The hamburger had conquered highways, shopping centres, and cities across the planet. It had become a symbol of convenience and modern life. But by the end of the 20th century, a new question began to emerge. What if the future of the hamburger did not depend on beef? For more than a century, the hamburger's identity had been tied to cattle. Beef was the centre of the story. The smell of grilled meat, the texture of a cooked patty, the familiar taste that millions of people recognized instantly. But the world around the hamburger was changing. Population growth was accelerating. Environmental concerns were becoming more urgent. Scientists, entrepreneurs, and consumers were examining how humanity would produce enough food for a growing population. The hamburger was entering a new chapter, not because people stopped loving burgers, because people started asking different questions. Could a hamburger exist without traditional meat? Could technology recreate the experience? Could a food invented through centuries of human adaptation be reinvented once again? The answer would come from an unexpected place. Science laboratories. For decades, vegetarian burgers had existed as alternatives for people who avoided meat. Early versions were often made from vegetables, grains, beans, and soy. They provided nutrition. But many struggled to imitate the taste and texture of beef. They were different foods. They were not trying to be hamburgers. Then a new generation of companies entered the field with a different goal. They did not want to create a substitute. They wanted to recreate the experience. This was a major shift. The challenge was not simply making something edible. Humanity had been doing that for thousands of years. The challenge was creating something that looked, cooked, smelled, and tasted close enough to beef that a person might not immediately notice the difference. That required understanding the hamburger at a microscopic level. Flavour, texture, chemistry, cooking reactions. A hamburger seems simple when it reaches your plate, but the experience comes from thousands of tiny details. The browning that happens when heat transforms proteins and sugars, the aroma released from fat, the texture created by muscle fibers, the way juices move through the bite. A hamburger is not one sensation, it is a collection of sensations working together. Modern food scientists began studying these details carefully. Companies such as Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat developed plant-based products designed to reproduce some of the qualities people associate with beef. Impossible Foods focused heavily on a molecule called heme, a compound naturally found in animal muscle that contributes to the flavour and aroma of meat. By producing a plant-based version of this compound, the company aimed to create a burger that behaved more like traditional beef during cooking. Beyond Meat approached the challenge through plant proteins and food engineering, creating textures designed to imitate ground meat. The results attracted enormous attention. Some customers loved them, some remained skeptical, some simply enjoyed having another option, and that is the important point. The hamburger has always survived by giving people choices. The original hamburger transformed scraps into a satisfying meal. The fast food hamburger transformed a local dish into a global product. The modern alternative burger transformed the idea of what the hamburger could be. The pattern repeated, adaptation, always adaptation. But the science of the hamburger did not stop with plants. Another development pushed the idea even further. Cultivated meat instead of raising an entire animal. Scientists began exploring whether meat could be grown from animal cells. The concept sounds like science fiction. But researchers have been developing the technology for years. In 2013, scientists produced one of the first publicly demonstrated cultivated beef burgers. The project attracted worldwide attention because it suggested a future where meat production could happen without traditional livestock farming. The burger cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to create. Hundreds of thousands. Not exactly the kind of meal you would order with fries. But the significance was not the price. The significance was the possibility. A hamburger had once required raising a cow, transporting it, processing it, and distributing the meat. Now scientists were asking whether the essential parts of meat could be produced in another way. This was not just about burgers, it was about the future of food itself. Of course, major challenges remained: cost, scale, consumer acceptance, regulation. A laboratory-produced burger had to become not only possible but practical, and people had to decide whether they wanted it. Food is emotional. People do not eat only with their mouths. They eat with memories, they eat with traditions, they eat with expectations. A hamburger from a backyard barbecue, a childhood restaurant, or a favorite roadside stop carries meaning beyond ingredients. You have to understand that context to see why changing the hamburger is so difficult. The hamburger is not simply a collection of molecules, it is a cultural object. It represents family meals, road trips, celebrations, ordinary afternoons. A person's reaction to a new kind of burger may have less to do with science and more to do with identity. But here is the twist. The hamburger has always been changing. The idea that there is one original hamburger is already misleading. The hamburger of ancient meat preservation traditions was different from the Hamburg steak served in 19th century Europe. The Hamburg steak was different from the American sandwich. The American sandwich was different from the fast food burger. The fast food burger was different from the gourmet versions served today. Change is not an interruption in the hamburger's history. Change is the entire history. And now the hamburger stands at another crossroads. It can become more sustainable. It can become more personalized. It can become more technologically advanced. Or it can remain tied to the traditions that made it famous. Perhaps the future will include all of these versions at once. A classic beef burger at a roadside restaurant. A plant-based burger in a city cafe. A cultivated meat burger created through advanced biotechnology. Different answers to the same human desire. A meal that is convenient, satisfying, and familiar. The hamburger began as a practical solution to a simple problem. How do you make meat easier to preserve and eat centuries later? The question has changed. How do you continue feeding a changing world? And the answer, once again, may come from the hamburger itself. The hamburger's journey from a humble piece of ground meat to a global symbol was built on innovation. But every great transformation carries consequences. The same systems that made burgers affordable for billions of people also created environmental, economic, and social challenges that could not be ignored forever. The hamburger became a symbol of abundance, but abundance has a cost. To understand the modern hamburger, you have to look beyond the restaurant counter. You have to follow the path backward. from the plate to the farm, from the farm to the feedlot, and from the feedlot to the enormous agricultural systems that support the world's appetite for beef. Because a hamburger is never just a hamburger, it is land, it is water, it is labour, it is transportation, it is energy, it is a chain stretching across continents. For most of human history, cattle were valuable because they provided many things at once. They produced milk, they provided labour, they reproduced, their hides became materials, their meat was only one part of their importance. Industrial agriculture changed that relationship. As demand for beef increased, cattle production became increasingly specialized. Large-scale operations developed methods for raising animals efficiently and producing meat at a scale that earlier generations could hardly imagine. The results were dramatic. Beef became cheaper. Hamburgers became available almost everywhere. Millions of people gained access to a food that previous generations would have considered occasional or expensive. But the system required enormous resources. Cattle need space. They need feed, they need water, they produce waste. And raising animals at industrial scale creates challenges that become larger with every additional hamburger sold. Here is the detail that changes how you see the meal. A hamburger that takes only a few minutes to cook represents months or years of production behind the scenes. The cow, the grain, the workers, the trucks, the processing facilities, the refrigeration systems, all of them are part of that single bite. This was not a problem created by one company or one country. It was the result of a global shift in how humanity produces food. As populations grew and incomes increased, more people around the world began consuming more animal products. Meat became associated with prosperity. In many countries, eating more beef represented economic progress. A family that could afford more meat often saw that as a sign of improvement. And that makes the story complicated. The hamburger represented opportunity for many people. It also created pressure on natural systems. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, researchers increasingly examined the environmental impact of livestock production. Studies focused on greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water consumption, and the effects of expanding agricultural land. Cattle became part of a larger conversation about climate change and sustainability. But this conversation required balance. The hamburger's history was not simply a story of destruction. It was also a story of human achievement. The same agricultural systems criticized for their environmental impact also helped feed billions of people. The same industrial methods that created problems also reduced hunger in many parts of the world. The challenge was not whether humanity should produce food. The challenge was how. And this question brought attention to another part of the hamburger story: the people who make it. But behind every inexpensive hamburger are workers, farm workers, factory workers, restaurant employees, delivery drivers. The fast food industry became one of the largest employers in many countries, offering millions of jobs, especially to young workers and people entering the labour market. But the industry also faced criticism over wages, working conditions, and job security. The hamburger became a symbol of opportunity. It also became a symbol in debates about the future of work. This contradiction appears throughout the hamburger's entire history. It creates and challenges at the same time. It connects people and creates conflict. It represents freedom and raises questions about responsibility. That is why the hamburger remains such a fascinating historical object. A simple food can reveal an entire civilization. Look at a hamburger and you can see ancient preservation techniques. You can see migration. You can see industrialization. You can see globalization. You can see modern consumer culture. The hamburger is like a small history book you can hold in your hand. But perhaps the most surprising chapter involves how deeply the hamburger became connected with American identity. For decades, the burger was used in advertising as a symbol of family, happiness, and everyday life. It appeared at backyard gatherings, sporting events, and celebrations. The image was simple: a person enjoying a meal, a family sharing time together, a moment of comfort. But behind that image was an enormous global system. This contrast is what makes the hamburger story so interesting. The front is simple, the back is complicated, the final product looks ordinary. The journey behind it is extraordinary, and this is where the story takes another turn. Because the hamburger did not only change how people ate, it changed how countries saw each other. When American fast food chains expanded around the world, they carried ideas about business, culture, and lifestyle along with their menus. A restaurant could become a symbol of foreign influence, a place where young people gathered, a place where traditional habits met modern choices. Sometimes that created excitement, sometimes it created resistance. In some countries, protests against fast food chains were not really about hamburgers, they were about globalization itself. The burger became a stand-in for larger questions. Who controls food? Who decides what modern life should look like? How much should cultures change? These debates continue today, and yet, despite all the controversy, the hamburger remains incredibly popular, because people do not choose foods only based on arguments. They choose foods based on memories, convenience, taste, and connection. The hamburger survived criticism because it became part of everyday life. It is no longer just an American product. It is a global food with thousands of local versions. And as the world faces new challenges, the hamburger is once again being forced to adapt. The same food that changed to fit medieval travelers, factory workers, suburban families, and international markets must now respond to a new era. A world asking different questions, a world looking for different answers, and the next stage of the hamburger's history will not be about making it bigger. It will be about making it last. The hamburger had become a global symbol, but symbols are rarely created by food alone. They are created by the people who eat them, the places where they appear, and the meanings they collect over time. A hamburger in one country could represent convenience. A hamburger in another could represent modernity. A hamburger somewhere else could represent a connection to a world beyond its borders. The same meal could carry completely different messages depending on where you encountered it. That is the strange power of the hamburger. It is ordinary enough to be familiar. It is important enough to tell a story. By the late 20th century, the hamburger had become deeply connected with American popular culture. It appeared in movies, television shows, advertisements, and music. It became part of the visual language of American life, a roadside restaurant, a family meal, a summer barbecue, a quick lunch during a busy day. The hamburger was everywhere. But here is the twist. The hamburger did not spread around the world simply because people wanted to copy America. It spread because people found ways to make it meaningful in their own lives. Food does not travel unchanged. It negotiates. It compromises. It adapts. When the hamburger arrived in new countries, it encountered different religious traditions, different agricultural systems, different ideas about taste, and different expectations about dining. Sometimes it changed completely. Sometimes it became a symbol of resistance. Sometimes it became a bridge between cultures. In India, the arrival of international hamburger chains required major adjustments. Beef was not a simple ingredient choice because cattle hold deep cultural and religious significance for many Hindus. Instead of treating this as an obstacle, companies redesigned their menus. Chicken burgers appeared. Vegetarian burgers appeared. Local spices entered the recipes. The hamburger became something different, not an American copy, an Indian interpretation. This pattern appeared repeatedly in countries where seafood was central to local diets. Restaurants created seafood-based versions in places with strong spice traditions. Burgers gained new flavors in regions where local breads were preferred. The familiar bun sometimes gave way to different forms of serving. The hamburger became a conversation between global influence and local identity. And this was not unique to modern fast food. This has always been how food history works. The potato travelled from South America and became central to Irish cuisine. Chili peppers travelled from the Americas and transformed Asian cooking. Coffee moved across continents and became part of cultures far from its original homeland. Food survived because humans reshape them. The hamburger simply followed the same ancient pattern. But the global burger boom also created another unexpected development, the rise of the gourmet hamburger. For decades, many people associated hamburgers with speed and affordability. They were practical meals, not luxury experiences. Then chefs began reconsidering the humble burger. They asked a different question. What happens if you treat a hamburger like a carefully prepared dish? The answer was a new generation of restaurants offering premium ingredients, specialized cooking methods, unusual toppings, and carefully selected meats. Suddenly, the hamburger could appear in places far removed from its fast food origins. A simple sandwich became a culinary experiment. Restaurants experimented with different cuts of beef. They created unusual flavor combinations. They focused on craftsmanship. The hamburger had entered another phase of reinvention. This was not about replacing the fast food burger. It was about expanding what the word hamburger could mean. And that expansion revealed something important. People were not tired of hamburgers. They were tired of the idea that one version had to represent all hamburgers. The burger became a category, not a single object. This flexibility explains why the hamburger has remained relevant for so long. Many foods experience periods of popularity and then disappear. Trends come and go, restaurants rise and fall, but the hamburger continued because it could exist in almost any environment. A street corner, a luxury restaurant, a school cafeteria, a backyard grill, an airport terminal, a stadium. It could belong almost anywhere. And that brings us to one of the hamburger's most surprising roles. It became a tool of diplomacy and cultural exchange. Restaurants abroad sometimes became meeting places where people encountered foreign ideas. For some customers, visiting a hamburger restaurant was their first experience with an international brand. It was not just about eating, it was about entering a different kind of space. The design, the music, the service style, the entire experience communicated something. Of course, this influence was not always welcomed. Some critics saw global fast food expansion as a threat to local traditions. They worried that international chains would replace regional foods and create a more uniform world. The concern was understandable. When one company can appear in thousands of cities across the planet, it raises questions about cultural diversity. Would every city eventually look the same? Would every meal become the same? The answer turned out to be more complicated. The hamburger spread globally, but local cultures changed the hamburger in return. The result was not one worldwide burger, it was thousands. A global food with local personalities, and that may be the greatest irony of all. The hamburger, a symbol often associated with standardization, became successful because people refused to leave it unchanged. It became powerful because it could be different. The hamburger's history is filled with contradictions. It began as a practical food and became a cultural icon. It represented simplicity and created a complex global industry. It became famous through standardization and survived through adaptation. It was a symbol of American influence and became something that belonged to the entire world. But the story of the hamburger is not only about restaurants and recipes, it is also about science. Because behind every burger is a question that has fascinated humans for thousands of years. How do we transform raw ingredients into something better? How do we use technology to improve food? How do we balance tradition with invention? The next chapter of the hamburger's story moved from kitchens and farms into laboratories, where scientists began examining the burger at its smallest level. Not the bun, not the toppings, not even the meat, the molecules themselves. And what they discovered would change the way people think about one of the world's most familiar foods. The hamburger had travelled farther than anyone could have imagined. It began as a practical solution for preserving meat, became a symbol of industrial America, and eventually found a place in almost every corner of the world. But the modern hamburger faced a new challenge, not how to spread, not how to sell, how to survive. The 21st century brought new questions about food, health, technology, and sustainability. People wanted to understand not only what they were eating, but where it came from and what impact it had on the world around them. The hamburger, once valued mainly for being affordable and convenient, became the centre of much larger conversations. What is the future of meat? What should a sustainable food system look like? Can science recreate the foods people love while reducing some of the problems connected to traditional production? These questions pushed researchers into territory that would have seemed impossible only a few generations earlier. The hamburger entered the laboratory, and the first challenge was understanding what made a burger feel like a burger. Because taste is not one simple thing. When you bite into a hamburger, your brain receives information from many sources at once. The smell rising from the grill, the texture of the patty, the flavour of fat, the slight crust created by heat, the combination of salt, seasoning, and other ingredients. A hamburger is an experience, not just a collection of ingredients. Food scientists began studying these details carefully. They examined proteins, fats, aromas, and cooking reactions to understand why traditional beef created such a familiar sensation. Here is the surprising part. The goal was not simply to make something that looked like meat. Many foods can look similar. The difficult part was recreating the experience, the sound of a burger cooking, the smell filling a kitchen, the texture when you take the first bite. Those details matter. This research led to a new generation of plant-based hamburgers. Earlier vegetarian burgers had existed for decades, but many were designed around nutrition rather than imitation. They were made from ingredients such as beans, grains, mushrooms, and vegetables. They were alternatives. They were not trying to convince anyone they were beef. The newer generation had a different mission: create something that could compete directly with traditional hamburgers. Companies developed methods using plant proteins, oils, and carefully selected ingredients to recreate some of the qualities people associated with beef. One company focused on the chemistry of meat flavor itself, exploring plant-based versions of compounds connected with the taste and aroma of cooked beef. Another concentrated on recreating the structure and texture of ground meat through combinations of plant proteins. The results changed the conversation. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether a vegetarian burger existed. The question was whether someone could tell the difference. That was a completely different challenge. Of course, reactions varied. Some consumers were impressed. Some preferred traditional beef. Some appreciated having more choices. Food has always been personal, and the hamburger carried generations of emotional connections. A person's favorite burger might remind them of childhood, a family tradition, a memorable trip, a special occasion. Replacing that experience required more than chemistry. It required understanding human behavior. But plant-based burgers were only one part of the technological revolution. Another idea pushed even further. Instead of creating meat from plants, what if scientists could create meat from animal cells? This concept became known as cultivated meat. The idea was simple to explain but incredibly difficult to achieve. Instead of raising an entire animal, researchers would grow animal cells under controlled conditions. The result would be real animal tissue without requiring traditional livestock production. The science behind this involved techniques originally developed through medical research, including growing cells outside living organisms. The possibility was enormous. A future where meat could be produced with less land. A future where agricultural systems could operate differently. A future where the hamburger might come from a completely new kind of farm, a laboratory. The first publicly demonstrated cultivated beef burger appeared in 2013, created by researchers led by Dutch scientist Mark Post. The project attracted worldwide attention because it showed that the concept was no longer just theoretical, but the price revealed the challenge. The burger cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce, hundreds of thousands. That was not a meal for a weekday lunch. It was a demonstration of possibility. The technology needed to become cheaper, faster, and easier to scale, and that process required years of research. This is where the hamburger's history follows a familiar pattern. A new idea often begins as something expensive and unusual. Then technology improves, production increases, costs fall. What once seemed impossible becomes ordinary. The first computers filled entire rooms. The first automobiles were luxury products. The first hamburgers were not global symbols. Transformation takes time. But there was another important factor shaping the future of the hamburger: consumer choice. Modern customers have more information than previous generations. They can learn about farming methods, ingredients, nutrition, and environmental impacts instantly. They can compare options. They can demand changes. The hamburger industry had to respond. Restaurants introduced new menu options. Companies explored different production methods. Farmers examined new approaches. The entire system began adjusting, and this reveals something fascinating about the hamburger. It has always been shaped by pressure. Ancient people faced the challenge of preserving meat. Immigrants faced the challenge of adapting traditions in a new country. Workers faced the challenge of finding affordable meals. Businesses faced the challenge of serving millions efficiently. Now humanity faced another challenge: creating a food system for the future. The hamburger survived every previous transformation because it adapted. That may be the reason it continues to matter. It is not just a recipe. It is a reflection of human priorities at different moments in history. Survival, convenience, affordability, identity, innovation. The hamburger has carried all of them. And as technology continues advancing, the next question becomes even stranger. Could the hamburger become something beyond food? Could it become a platform for nutrition, personalized diets, and entirely new approaches to eating? The answer is still unfolding, but one thing is clear. The hamburger's story is not ending. After more than a century of reinvention, the world's most familiar sandwich is still changing. The hamburger's future was being rewritten by science. But another transformation was happening at the same time. The world was not only asking what a hamburger could be made from, it was asking what a hamburger could represent. For more than a century, the hamburger had been connected with speed and convenience. It was the meal you grabbed between appointments, the food you ate during a road trip, the familiar option when you entered a city you had never visited before. But the modern hamburger became something larger. It became a canvas, a place where chefs, scientists, entrepreneurs, and consumers could experiment with new ideas. This was not the first time the hamburger had changed. It had already transformed from minced meat traditions into Hamburg steak, from Hamburg steak into an American sandwich, from a local meal into a global industry. Every generation added something new, and the 21st century added a new obsession: customization. Modern consumers increasingly wanted food that matched their personal preferences. They wanted different ingredients, different nutritional profiles, different cultural influences. The hamburger was perfectly suited for this. Remove the beef, change the bread, add new flavors, create new toppings. The basic structure remained recognizable, but the possibilities expanded. This was not a weakness. It was the reason the hamburger survived. A rigid food disappears when the world changes. A flexible food changes with it. Restaurants began exploring combinations that would have seemed unusual decades earlier. Burgers appeared with regional spices, unusual sauces, alternative proteins, and ingredients borrowed from cuisines around the world. The hamburger became a meeting point, a traditional American symbol, a global experiment, a reflection of local tastes. And this evolution happened not only in restaurants, it happened inside homes. The rise of food delivery services and digital platforms changed how people interacted with meals. A person no longer needed to walk into a restaurant to experience a hamburger. They could order from a phone, customize ingredients, compare options, and have food arrive at their door. The hamburger adapted to the digital age. Again, here is the strange part. A food that became famous because of physical movement, cars, and highways was now being transformed by technology that reduced the need to travel at all. The roadside burger and the smartphone burger belonged to completely different worlds, yet they were connected by the same idea: convenience. But convenience was no longer the only concern. Health became another major factor. For much of the hamburger's modern history, bigger was often treated as better. Larger portions, extra toppings, and indulgent combinations became common features of burger culture. But changing attitudes toward nutrition created new expectations. People began paying more attention to ingredients, calories, protein, and food quality. The hamburger industry responded with new options: smaller portions, alternative ingredients, different cooking methods, more transparency about what went into the food. This did not mean everyone abandoned traditional burgers. They did not. Millions of people still wanted the classic experience: a grilled beef patty, a toasted bun, a familiar combination of flavors. The difference was that the hamburger no longer needed to be only one thing. It could exist in multiple forms at once. That may be the greatest achievement of its long history. It learned how to divide without disappearing. A luxury burger and a fast food burger could both exist. A plant-based burger and a beef burger could both exist. A traditional recipe and a futuristic experiment could both carry the same name. The hamburger became a category large enough to contain contradictions, and those contradictions reveal something deeper about food history. People often imagine that traditional foods remain unchanged forever, but almost every famous food is a story of constant adjustment. Recipes evolve, ingredients move, techniques improve, taste changes. The hamburger is not unusual because it changed. It is unusual because it changed so many times while remaining recognizable. Nowhere is this clearer than in the relationship between hamburgers and technology. The modern food industry uses advanced methods to improve everything from farming to cooking. Data systems track supply chains. Machines improve consistency. New equipment allows restaurants to prepare meals faster and more efficiently. Even the simple act of cooking a burger has become connected to technology. Temperature control, automated systems, precision cooking. These developments might seem far removed from the old hamburger stands of the early 20th century, but the goal remains surprisingly similar. Make food reliable, make food accessible, make food satisfying. The tools changed. The purpose stayed the same. And here is another detail that often gets overlooked. The hamburger is not only a food product, it is an economic engine. The industry supports farmers, manufacturers, transportation workers, restaurant employees, advertisers, and countless businesses connected to food production. Every hamburger sold represents a network of human activity. A single meal can connect a ranch in one country with a restaurant in another. It can involve technology developed in a laboratory and ingredients produced on farms thousands of miles away. The hamburger is small. The system behind it is enormous. This is why the hamburger remains such a valuable object for understanding modern history. If you study the hamburger, you are studying migration. You are studying capitalism. You are studying agriculture. You're studying science. You're studying culture. A simple sandwich becomes a window into how societies organize themselves. And yet, despite all this complexity, the emotional connection remains remarkably simple. People enjoy hamburgers because they taste good, because they are familiar, because they create memories. A child eating their first hamburger, a family gathering around a grill, friends meeting at a restaurant after a long week. The hamburger survives not only because of industry, it survives because people attach meaning to it. That may be the most important lesson from its entire history. Technology can change ingredients, businesses can change systems, cultures can change recipes, but food remains human. The hamburger's future will likely include machines, laboratories, new ingredients, and new ideas. But somewhere in that future, people will still gather around a meal, they will still share stories, they will still create memories, and they will still hold a hamburger in their hands, perhaps without realizing that they are holding centuries of human history. The hamburger had spent more than a century changing shape. But its greatest transformation may have been the way people thought about it. For generations, the burger was judged by simple questions. Was it affordable? Was it filling? Did it taste good? Those questions still mattered. But the modern world added new ones. Where did it come from? How was it produced? What impact did it have? Could it become something better? The hamburger entered an era where every bite carried a larger conversation. This was not the first time food had faced this kind of attention. Throughout history, everyday ingredients often became connected to bigger issues. Sugar revealed the brutal realities of plantation economies. Salt exposed the importance of trade and taxation. Coffee became tied to colonialism, commerce, and social change. The hamburger joined that long tradition. It became a way to understand the modern world. And one of the most interesting developments was the rise of the premium burger. For decades, fast food chains had defined the public image of the hamburger. The burger was quick, standardized, and inexpensive. It was designed for efficiency. Then chefs began looking at the hamburger differently. They saw not a simple meal. They saw a foundation, a blank page, a chance to combine tradition with creativity. Restaurants began using specialized cuts of beef, handmade buns, regional ingredients, and carefully prepared sauces. Some burgers became expensive meals served in places far removed from the original lunch counters and roadside stands. The contrast was almost humorous. A food once associated with factory workers and quick meals was now appearing on menus alongside carefully prepared dishes and expensive wines. The hamburger had climbed from the bottom of the social ladder to the top, but it had not abandoned its roots. That is what made the burger unusual. It could exist in a luxury restaurant and a neighborhood diner. It could be a carefully designed culinary creation, or a simple meal after a long day. Few foods could move between those worlds so easily. The rise of gourmet burgers also revealed something about human attachment to familiar foods. People did not want to leave the hamburger behind. They wanted new versions of something they already loved. This pattern appeared again and again throughout history. Humans rarely abandon familiar foods completely. They modify them. They personalize them. They carry them into new environments. The hamburger followed the same path. But while chefs experimented with flavors, scientists and businesses were examining something much deeper, the ingredients themselves. The future of the hamburger became connected with the future of agriculture. By the early 21st century, concerns about climate change, land use, and resource consumption encouraged researchers to look for new approaches to food production. The question was not whether people enjoyed hamburgers. They clearly did. The question was whether the traditional way of producing them could continue as the global population grew. This led to a wave of innovation. Some companies focused on improving traditional agriculture. Others developed plant-based alternatives. Others explored cultivated meat. Each approach attempted to solve a different part of the same challenge. How can humanity continue enjoying familiar foods while reducing pressure on the planet? There was no single answer. There was no simple replacement. Food systems are too complex for that. A hamburger connects farmers, workers, businesses, consumers, and ecosystems. Changing one part affects many others. This is where the hamburger becomes more than a meal. It becomes a symbol of a much larger human challenge, balancing desire with responsibility. And this balance was not only about the environment, it was also about culture. As the hamburger spread globally, it became part of debates about identity. Some people celebrated it as a symbol of creativity and connection. Others worried that global food brands could weaken local traditions. Both reactions came from the same reality. The hamburger had become powerful. A sandwich could influence conversations about globalization. A sandwich could become part of arguments about economics and culture. A sandwich could represent opportunity to one person and disruption to another. That is not because the hamburger itself had changed. It was because the world around it had changed. The hamburger reflected the concerns of every era it entered. In the 19th century, it reflected immigration and urban growth. In the 20th century, it reflected industrialization and consumer culture. In the 21st century, it reflects questions about sustainability and technology. The burger became a historical mirror. And here is the detail that makes this story fascinating. The hamburger was never controlled by one group alone, not by German immigrants, not by American companies, not by chefs, not by scientists. Every generation added something. Every culture reshaped it. Every consumer choice influenced where it went next. The hamburger's history is not the story of a single invention. It is the story of continuous reinvention. Even the idea of the perfect hamburger has changed over time. For one generation, perfection meant a cheap meal after a difficult work day. For another, it meant a family gathering around a backyard grill. For another, it meant a carefully crafted restaurant experience. For the next generation, it may mean something created through entirely new technology. The definition keeps moving. The hamburger keeps moving with it. And that may explain why this food has survived when countless others have disappeared. It does not demand that people choose between the past and the future. It allows both to exist. A classic burger can sit beside a futuristic one. A traditional recipe can exist beside a scientific experiment. A local favorite can exist beside a global brand. The hamburger is not successful because it stayed the same. It is successful because it learned how to change without losing its identity. But there is still one final question, after all the centuries of migration, invention, controversy, and transformation. What does the hamburger actually mean today? The answer is waiting in the modern world, where this simple sandwich has become something far larger than anyone could have imagined when the first pieces of seasoned meat were shaped by human hands. The hamburger has become one of the most recognizable foods on earth, but its true significance is not found only in restaurants or menus. Its history is a story about movement, adaptation, technology, and the endless human search for better ways to survive. A hamburger looks simple, a bun, a patty, a few toppings, but simplicity can hide complexity. Inside that familiar meal is a story stretching across thousands of years, connecting ancient preservation techniques, European migration, industrial manufacturing, global trade, and modern science. The hamburger became famous because it answered basic human needs. People needed food that was affordable. People needed food that was portable. People needed food that could fit into increasingly busy lives. The hamburger succeeded because it understood something fundamental. People are always changing, and their food changes with them. Today, hamburgers exist in almost every corner of the world. They appear in major cities and small towns. They are served in restaurants, homes, stadiums, airports, and roadside stops. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Billions of burgers are consumed around the world every year. Billions. A food that once represented practicality became one of the largest categories in the global food industry. The modern hamburger economy involves enormous networks of farmers, processors, transportation companies, restaurants, and technology providers. It is a machine built around a meal that can be eaten in a few minutes. Think about that for a second. A person can finish a hamburger quickly, but the journey behind it may involve years of production and thousands of people. The hamburger is a reminder that everyday objects often contain hidden histories. The phone in your hand, the The clothes you wear, the food on your plate, ordinary things are rarely ordinary when you look closely, and the hamburger may be one of the clearest examples. But the modern burger is also facing a changing world. Consumers are no longer only asking whether food tastes good, they're asking where it comes from, they're asking how it is made, they're asking what kind of future it creates. This has pushed the hamburger industry into a period of experimentation unlike anything before. Traditional beef burgers continue to dominate. They remain deeply connected to memories, traditions, and personal preferences. A backyard barbecue is not simply about ingredients. It is about gathering. It is about conversation. It is about moments people remember years later. At the same time, new versions of the hamburger continue appearing. Plant-based burgers, cultivated meat, locally sourced ingredients, new cooking technologies. The hamburger is becoming a meeting point between history and innovation. And this is not unusual. The foods that survive the longest are often the foods that adapt the most. Bread changed as it traveled across civilizations. Coffee changed as it moved between continents. Pizza changed as it crossed oceans. The hamburger followed the same pattern. It did not remain frozen in one moment. It evolved. One of the most interesting things about the hamburger is that almost every country that embraced it created its own version. There is no single global hamburger. There are countless interpretations. A burger in one place may emphasize spices. Another may focus on local ingredients. Another may transform the entire concept into something completely different. The hamburger became global not because everyone agreed on what it should be. It became global because people disagreed creatively. That is a powerful lesson about culture. Influence does not always erase identity. Sometimes it creates new forms of identity. A food can travel thousands of miles and still become local. This happened with the hamburger again and again. A German name became connected with American culture. An American fast food symbol became adapted around the world. A global product became a collection of local traditions. The hamburger's history is filled with these contradictions. It was industrial and personal. It was standardized and customized. It was inexpensive and sometimes luxurious. It was criticized and celebrated. It was considered ordinary and historically significant at the same time. That is why the hamburger remains fascinating. It reveals how societies change. It reveals what people value. It reveals how technology influences even the simplest parts of daily life. The hamburger was never just about eating. It was about how humans organized the world around them. The ancient traveler needed portable food. The factory worker needed an affordable meal. The suburban family needed convenience. The global consumer needed choice. The modern world needs sustainability. The hamburger answered each moment differently, and perhaps that is why it continues to survive. It listens, it changes, it adapts. But beneath all those transformations, something remains constant. People want food that brings satisfaction. They want food that connects them with others. They want food that becomes part of their memories. A hamburger can be eaten alone during a busy afternoon. It can be shared among friends. It can be prepared at home. It can be discovered in a foreign country. It can represent comfort in a familiar place or curiosity in a new one. The hamburger is flexible because human life is flexible. Our circumstances change. Our technology changes. Our priorities change. Our food changes with us. And now, after centuries of transformation, the hamburger stands at another turning point. The future may bring new ingredients, new production methods, and new ideas about what a burger can be. Some people will choose traditional beef, Some will choose alternatives. Some will combine old methods with new technology. There may never be one final version of the hamburger, and perhaps that is exactly why it has lasted. The hamburger was never one thing, it was a journey from ancient kitchens to modern laboratories, from immigrant communities to global corporations, from humble beginnings to worldwide recognition. The story of the hamburger is ultimately the story of humanity itself, a story of movement, a story of invention, a story of adaptation, and now, after everything it has survived, the hamburger is ready for whatever comes next. The hamburger's story began long before anyone called it a hamburger. It began with humans searching for practical solutions in a difficult world. Meat had to be preserved, food had to travel, families had to survive. From ancient communities experimenting with ground meat to European cities refining chopped beef dishes, the foundations were slowly forming. No single person created the hamburger. No single moment explains its rise. Instead, generations of people added small changes that eventually created something extraordinary. The hamburger became a bridge between eras. It connected old traditions with new technology. It connected local kitchens with global industries. It connected ordinary meals with some of the biggest questions facing the modern world. It was there when migration carried European food traditions across the Atlantic. It was there when industrial cities created new demands for faster meals. It was there when automobiles transformed the way people traveled and ate. It was there when global companies turned a simple sandwich into an international symbol. It was there when cultures collided. It was there when new ideas emerged. It was there when humanity began questioning the future of food itself. The hamburger was never just meat between bread. It was movement, it was adaptation, it was history. Think about that the next time you hold one in your hands. The hamburger you eat today carries traces of ancient survival strategies, 19th century immigration, 20th century industrialization, and 21st century innovation. It contains decisions made by farmers, cooks, inventors, entrepreneurs, and millions of ordinary people whose names will never appear in history books. That is what makes everyday objects so fascinating. They are quiet records of human experience. A hamburger can tell you about economics because its price reflects entire supply chains. It can tell you about culture because every country reshapes it differently. It can tell you about technology because every stage of its production has been transformed by human invention. The hamburger's history is not perfect. It contains uncomfortable chapters. It reveals environmental challenges. It exposes difficult questions about labor and industrial food systems. It shows the consequences of trying to feed billions of people in a rapidly changing world. But history is not about finding perfect objects. It is about understanding real ones. And the hamburger is real. It reflects human creativity and human problems at the same time. It represents progress and consequence. It represents comfort and controversy. That contradiction is exactly why it matters. A food this familiar can make people forget that it has a history at all. A hamburger sitting on a plate seems ordinary. But ordinary things often hide the most remarkable stories. The same meal that began with practical preservation techniques became a global cultural symbol. The same meal that once carried immigrant memories became connected with American identity. The same meal that represented industrial efficiency is now part of conversations about sustainability and the future of food. The hamburger keeps changing because the world keeps changing. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson behind its long journey. Human beings are always adapting. We adapt our tools. We adapt our homes. We adapt our technologies. We adapt our food. The hamburger is simply one delicious example of that endless process. It was there when ancient cooks searched for ways to preserve meat. It was there when empires expanded trade routes and connected distant communities. It was there when immigrants carried familiar flavors into new countries. It was there when factories, highways, and cities reshaped daily life. It was there when globalization changed the way cultures interacted. It was there when science began imagining entirely new ways of producing food. But the hamburger's journey is still unfinished. New generations will continue reshaping it, just as earlier generations did before them. The next chapter has already begun, and today, it is there in your kitchen, on your plate, or perhaps waiting inside a paper wrapper during a busy day. A meal that once travelled across continents now sits quietly in your hand. That is the strange beauty of history. The biggest transformations often end up becoming the most familiar things. The hamburger did not become legendary because it was rare. It became legendary because it became part of everyday life. Not bad for a simple sandwich built from ground meat, bread, and centuries of human imagination. If this story changed the way you look at something ordinary, do me a favor and hit subscribe, leave a like, and comment which part of the hamburger's history surprised you the most. More stories of everyday objects that shape the world are coming, and I will see you in the next one.